Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Graham Pike, and I'm Dean of International Education here at Vancouver Island University. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Tsunamo First Nations. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody to this Arts and Humanities Colloquium. A warm welcome especially to our members from the community. It's always great to have you come onto campus. And also to all the students, particularly students from the English Language Centre who are here, and I think also students from the high school. The topic of this colloquium, social media and resistance in China, is one of particular interest to me. I'm a frequent traveller to China, and I've been fascinated by the rapid pace of development and economic growth of China over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And it's a pace of development that I think raises a number of questions about the direction that we as humans are taking in terms of our development. And it's the kind of questions that the Industrial Revolution in the UK began to ask 200, 250 years ago, and questions that I think we're still struggling with in terms of finding appropriate solutions. And these are questions such as, should economic growth be the major factor in shaping human development? In other words, should we allow the principles of the global free market to determine what gets produced by whom and for whom? Or should there be some controls? And if so, who should exert that control? Questions such as what's the appropriate role of technology and technological revolution? We know that humans are innately creative animals and should continue to be so. But should those innovations, should that innovative spirit be pursued without restrictions, even if what we then produce is potentially harmful to us or to the planet? And questions such as what system of governance is best to ensure equitable and sustainable human development? Is democracy, as we define it in the West, is that the most effective form? Or can a case be made for more centralized forms of control, as certainly we see in China and in other places around the world? And what are or should be the rights and responsibilities of citizens like ourselves in terms of participation in whatever form of governance is chosen? And I think the social media, the topic of Professor Stetar's talk this morning, has really heightened that question about the role of participation of ordinary people in systems of governance. And these are all key questions that relate to the concept of citizenship. What role should we play as citizens, both at a local level, at a national level, and indeed at a global level? And I think these questions also underscore, for me, the importance of the arts and humanities. These are very complex global issues that require critical and creative thinking in terms of finding appropriate solutions, that require an ability to learn from the past in order to develop a better vision for the future. As Albert Einstein said, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking. And it's that way of thinking that I think the arts and humanities is best equipped to pursue, to explore, to find alternative ways of thinking, alternative visions. And the key for me is the exploration of the concept of value. What do we really value as human beings? And how do we ensure that the decisions that we make individually and collectively actually live up to our chosen values? And I think, particularly today, Valentine's Day, that's a very appropriate topic to reflect upon. So I'm really excited and really looking forward to this presentation. And I'd now like to invite Marnie Stanley from the English and Women's Studies departments to introduce our speaker.
On behalf of the Colloquium Committee, I would like to thank the Dean of Arts and Humanities, who I assume is here somewhere. In the back, thank you. Ross McKay for his and his office's support of this series. I would like to thank the theater for providing us with their space and their technical support. And I would like to thank the Media Research Lab for filming this series. And I would also like to thank the members of the Colloquium Committee for all the work they do to gather us together for this wonderful and diverse series. Doug Stetar teaches in the Digital Media Studies Department here at Vancouver Island University and is director of the Media Research Lab. His teaching focuses on cultural and media theory, global cultural studies, popular culture. This is his office. The best way to know a faculty member is to see their office. And these photos come courtesy of Janice Porteous, who did an exhibition on modern cabinets of curiosities, i.e. faculty offices. And so these are her photos from Doug's office. So it gives you some insight into his popular culture interests. He also works in applied digital media and other fields. His work in digital film and video production has included serving as an executive producer on over a dozen film projects. Doug studied, among other places, at Emily Carr, at the Maryland College of Art and Design, and at Goddard College. One of the things I most admire about him as a colleague is that he combines an artist's sensibility with a theorist's sensibility. 2.5 years ago, Doug began studying Mandarin to support his research on Chinese culture and media, and that's the work he will be sharing with us today. Honored guests, please join me in welcoming Shen Lao Shi.
Thank you. It figures with all the high tech that I would be tripped up by the oldest tech known to mankind. 欢迎大家，特别欢迎中国留学生们。我要开始问你们，请宽恕，因为我的汉语不太好。我希望你们和我一起把中国介绍给我的同学们。I want to, sorry, my bad. Before I get started, I want to thank Marnie for the generous introduction. Katharina and Daniel and the entire Colloquium Committee for all the work they put in. They put in a tremendous amount of work to make this happen. I also want to thank Graham for his introduction, and I especially want to thank International Education and Audrey Hansen. They have supported me for the past couple of years in going to China to aid in the study of Mandarin, and that's been both generous and essential for me. And finally, I want to thank my extremely patient wife, Catherine, who is out there somewhere, who's followed me to China and put up with an enormous amount of really badly enunciated Mandarin in our house over the past couple of years as I struggled through. Thank you, people. So, Song of the Grass Mud Horse, Language and Resistance in Chinese Social Media. To get us started in this, I want to frame this process and this discussion in 4 basic parts. Like anything to do with China, it's complex, really complex. So I want to start by giving us a little bit of grounding and a little bit of context in China itself. So I'm going to call that fairly straightforwardly understanding China. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the difficulty we have in the West in understanding and relating to China, and there's good historical reasons for that. The second part is I'm going to talk about learning Mandarin. And I'm not going to talk about my experience learning Mandarin. I'm actually going to introduce you a little bit to Mandarin. So you'll just stick your toe in Mandarin. Because we need to understand just a little bit about Mandarin to understand the humor that's going on and the wordplay that's going on here. Then in part 3, I'm going to introduce us to some of this wordplay and some of this actual material. And then in the fourth part, I want to consider what we've looked at. And really you look at it from the perspective of China at the crossroads, or maybe a crossroads would be a better way to put it. Because certainly China has a feeling right now of being at a bit of a crossroads. The new leadership has been in place for about a year now. And certainly the last of the chosen successors by Deng Xiaoping, who we'll talk about in a while, has gone. So it feels like China has some decisions to make. Part 1, more of the most. The most gleaming modern airports I've been to are in China. The coolest and most technologically challenging hotel I've stayed at is in China. The most tricked out hair salon I've been to is in China. The worst pollution I've endured is in China. I keep going back for more of the most. Amy Tan, the American novelist. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that China is big, and this is not really a surprise to anyone, I don't think. And China is big geographically, slightly smaller than Canada, but really where China is big, and we all know this, is in population. By current estimates, 1.346 billion people. Obviously, there's a little bit of guessing in there, I would say. This means that China has just over 1 in 5 people on the planet. So every 5th person on the planet is in China. China has, to sort of conceptualize or contextualize this a little, China has 170 cities with a population of over 1 million. The US has 10. Canada, I believe, has 1 now with Toronto. Montreal might be, it depends how you define it. So Vancouver has a population larger than that, but the city itself is not. And then I threw this in, the next one is that China must be 23% of the world's population on 7% of the world's arable land. And this is an important thing that we can never forget about China. By comparison, countries like the United States feed their population using only a fraction of their available arable land. Whereas in China, essentially we can say they're using every scrap of land they have. And it's a given in the study of China that there's not a lot the Chinese can do to increase production on this land. It's very manual, it's very labor-intensive and manual type of agriculture they practice, but the general consensus is modernizing or mechanizing that would not give them more food. So this has a lot to do with how China sort of functions and sees the world. And then the last one was just a little bit of a fun fact I threw in there for you. China produces 50% of the world's cement, which I think is a little bit interesting. The UN predicts that China's population will actually peak around 2030, and by 2080, the UN suspects China will have fewer than 1 billion people. So the Chinese population is on a sort of rounding curve and will go down. This, of course, has to do with their very earnest efforts to reduce population, the infamous one-child policy. It definitely has come at a high cost, but it has definitely been successful for the Chinese. By the way, before we leave this slide, the next largest producer of cement in the world is India, but they produce only 6% of the cement in the world. The next thing I want to talk about China is that it's in a hurry. China is really about going places, if you will. So just some facts here. Between 2011 and 2016, China will open a new airport every month, buy 6 new jetliners every week, add 3,100 miles of high-speed rail, bringing that total up to over 9,000 miles of high-speed rail. And they'll open a new university every month. China has approximately 4,000 universities today and a university population of around 15 million students. Interestingly enough, China is also one of the largest countries in the world, serves one of the largest population of international students. The other thing to note is that China is rapidly becoming the country with the most second language English speakers in the world, and is predicted to pass India fairly soon. The next thing I want to talk about is China is on the move. Between 1979 and 2000, something in the order of 340 million people migrated from the countryside or the rural parts of China to the cities. And this is, if you've studied China at all, you know this is a seminal thing in the history of China. It's a seminal thing in the history of our planet. It's the largest migration that's ever occurred on the planet. It's fundamentally reshaped China. And we have to remember that as this plays out through the economics of China, it's fundamentally reshaped the world. A question I'm going to ask you to think about partway through, but I'll maybe seed it in your mind now, is to imagine what the world would be like if 32 years ago, Deng Xiaoping had not decided to initiate economic reform in China. And China was today still closed, producing very little GDP internationally, and not really a factor economically. Our whole world would be different, radically different. So when Deng initiated those reforms, he changed not only China, he changed the face of the planet. So this migration changed the face of the planet. And it plays very large today in China. It's a very significant thing for the Chinese. Most of these immigrants to the cities are still technically not legally allowed to be there. Through the Hoku or registration system, they don't have legal addresses in the cities. That means things like their children must go back to the home area they came from to go to school because they can't register them in school, which causes enormous hardship. So it's one of the most important things. China also has the largest annual movement of human beings, and that's the Chunjie, or Spring Festival, what we would refer to most commonly as Chinese New Year's. You'll remember there's 1.36 billion people in China. The Spring Festival this year was just finished. The estimate was that there was 2.6 billion individual trips during that week. That means everyone virtually in the country went there and back. Now, that's probably not the case, but it boggles the mind to think of 2.6 billion individual trips in 1 week in one country. So needless to say, the people I communicate with and work with in China are not available during that week. They tend to disappear. So I want to use a case and study here, just to, or sort of a case just to talk about it. We're looking at a place called Pudong in Shanghai, the green part over there. In Shanghai in 1987, China designated a swampland east of the Hongpu River called Pudong as a special economic zone. They set out to create, in their own words, the Manhattan of the East. So Pudong is this part over here, the big green part. Pudong simply means east of the Pu River. The result was the largest construction boom in the history of our planet. Over the next 20 years, 25% of all the construction cranes on the planet were in Pudong on average. And this is what they accomplished over 23 years. So that's, 26 years. Those photographs are 26 years apart. And that gives you a sense of, when you go to China, for those of you who haven't been, it gives you a sense of the enormity of the change going on in China. It's not simply that they're doing a lot, it's that they're doing a lot in a hurry. They really are going. One of the things that surprises people when they first go to China is that they see many construction projects, and that doesn't surprise them. The fact that they go 24 hours a day normally tends to surprise us. But when you see large construction projects in China, they don't stop. They literally go non-stop. You see the largest building over there in Asia. It's got a few cranes on the top of it. When I first went to China 2.5 years ago, that was very small, just on the bottom, shooting up. The bottle opener building next to it was the tallest building in Asia, and then in Singapore they built a taller one, so the Chinese, of course, have built a taller one again to make sure they maintain that, and I'm all for that kind of good old-fashioned competition. By the way, if you're ever in Shanghai, you'll definitely go to Pudong. At the top of that little bottle opener is a bar. So you can go to the bar and stand on the glass floor and look down, whatever it is, I don't know, 5 million floors. I'm not happy with heights. I didn't go near it. I stood at the ground and watched my friends and colleagues do it. There's a saying they have in China, 150 years of history in 2,500 years, and then 2,500 years of history in 150 years. And what this refers to is that for 2.5 centuries, China had a very stable form of government. It's known as the dynasties. You've probably heard of Chinese dynasties, the great dynasties, the 12 dynasties that ruled China for most of 2,700 years. So very little changes in a certain way. It's a very stable system. Then in the 19th century, the wonderful Western powers come marching into China, and everything changes. We might say everything falls apart. So for the next 150 years, China goes through a lot of history. An awful lot is jammed into 150 years for the Chinese. And that's what they mean when they say this. So I'm not going to talk too much about the dynasties other than to say they're probably in a class by themselves as a form of government on our planet. 12 dynasties ruled China for most of 2,700 years, far eclipsing any other form of government in terms of stability and scope that we have on the planet. What I'm going to focus on is China's painful memories. And China has some very painful memories of the past 150 years. And these are important for us to understand because they influence Chinese thinking a great deal. They have a lot to do with how China sees itself and how China views the rest of the world, because a lot of this pain was caused by the rest of the world. So there's 4 things I want to talk about. The so-called century of humiliation, which is the 19th century essentially, more or less. I want to talk about the post-dynasty chaos when the dynasties collapse and the warlords take over. Then I want to talk about the War of Resistance. And the War of Resistance is the Chinese word for, or the Chinese term for their fight against Japan. We would mostly think of that in the West as the Second World War, but in China it actually starts a bit earlier. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the Civil War in China in the mid-1940s between the communists and the nationalists. So those are the 4 things that shape Chinese worldview, I would argue. So in the century of humiliation, what we really have, first of all, is the unequal treaties that China is forced into. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details because time doesn't allow it, but essentially the British, German, Russian, French, American, Japanese came to China, discovered there was a lot of good things there that they could buy, sell, trade. And China was relatively weak militarily versus the West at that point. So the West felt no compunction against taking advantage of this, and they forced upon the Chinese what are called the unequal treaties. Again, without going into details, trust me, they're fairly unequal. They benefit the Western powers greatly, and they don't benefit the Chinese at all. Then the next thing we want to talk about is the opium trade, and I think the opium trade, we probably know about it, the image there of the Chinese individual using opium, but it bears discussion. It's estimated, well, first of all, let's talk about what the opium trade was and where it came from. The opium trade was established by the British, being the ever-good merchants that they are. They knew they wanted to import a lot of things from China, tea, silk, etc., but they didn't want an imbalance of trade, so they needed something to trade back to the Chinese. Unfortunately for the British, there was nothing the Chinese really wanted, so the English, being clever, that they, as they were, invented something or manufactured something for the Chinese to want, and that was opium. So the British sent opium to China as part of a trade triangle with India, their holdings in India, and it was essentially a way for them to pay for things they were shipping out of China. China didn't like this and tried to get opium out of China, and in the Treaty of 1858, the United Kingdom or Britain forced China to actually legalize the opium trade. And this is an important thing for the dynasties because it's an incredible loss of face for them. So at that point, they're forcing China to legalize opium as a trade. By 1990, it's estimated that there were 40 million opium users in China with 15 million addicts. So we can stop and think about it this way, because the century of humiliation is about China's interaction with the West. So let's think about that for a minute. For every single Chinese person that was converted to Christianity by the Western powers, 15 Chinese individuals were addicted to opium. So not surprisingly, the view of the 19th century in the West tends to be different in the Asian experience than it is in China. And in the West, we tend to want to forget about the imperial period. The Chinese don't so much want to forget about this. They bear this in mind. After the dynasties fall, the last of the dynasties, the Qing dynasty falls in 1911, we get 30, 40, 50 years of what's called chaos. And it's tremendously chaotic. And it entails a lot of hardship for regular Chinese. Essentially, warlords are running the country. There's a lot of hardship. There's a lot of, it's not a particularly nice place to be, let's put it that way. And the Chinese remember this too. One of the things we'll talk about when we talk about the government today is that the Chinese don't want chaos. They don't like chaos. They've had a lot of chaos in the past 100 years. They want stability. It's something they value greatly. As the chaos tails off, and it's complicated because the nationalists actually sort of co-opt a lot of the warlords to make nationalists out of them. But we get probably the singular thing in the 20th century that the Chinese remember, and that's the war of resistance with Japan. Japan had been in China, or was in China, from the end of the middle of the 19th century. They never left. And they became more and more egregious in their demands in China, and by the early 1930s, they had essentially begun to invade China, and the Chinese had begun to fight back. They fight against the Chinese until against the Japanese until 1945, when the Second World War ends. And today, there's a lot of controversy still about the Chinese occupation and fighting in Japan. For example, China and Japan have continuing friction about what happened at Nanjing. Chinese government insisting there was a massacre at Nanjing of about 200,000 to 300,000 people, including women and children. The Japanese tended to accept this for a period, but some politicians and academics in Japan have started to argue it wasn't a very bad massacre, and this has not surprisingly upset the Chinese greatly. So China and Japan have very strained relationships. They have for probably since the end of the Second World War. So the war of resistance is very important. The last thing is the Civil War. After the end of World War II, there were two claiming governments in China, the nationalists supported by the West and the communists supported by Moscow. And they fought a civil war. All I'll say about that is that the nationalists had everything going for them militarily, economically, and in terms of foreign support, and they got absolutely, they got their butts kicked by the communists, if you want to put it that way. And I think the main reason for that is that the people wanted what the communists were offering at that point in time. That's important to remember. So that brings us to the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949. This is what we would refer to as Communist China. And the thing about the People's Republic of China that most people in the West don't understand or think about is we really need to divide it into two periods. We have the period I would call of Mao's excesses. We could just call it the Mao period when Chairman Mao was alive. And then after Mao's death in 1975, 76, we have Deng Xiaoping, who establishes control by 1978 and introduces his reforms. Mao's excesses are fairly well documented, I think, for many people. I'm just going to name two of them, or talk about two of them. The Great Leap Forward. After coming to power, Mao kind of encouraged the Chinese population to just modernize China really by force of will, just working harder and doing better. And he had some slightly unusual optimistic ideas about how that would happen. I think one thing we can fairly say about Mao Zedong is that he was a very good political leader. He appears to be a very good leader of people, but he was not a good economic leader. Every economic plan he had for China appeared to end in disaster, essentially. So the Great Leap Forward, he does all kinds of crazy things with the people. He's got them making steel in their backyard furnaces instead of growing crops. The steel's not any good because the furnaces don't work, and the lack of crops leads to, well, as you can imagine, starvation. And the Great Leap Forward was marked by a famine, a large famine. Probably tens of millions of people died. There's a wonderful account by an academic at the University of, at Peking University, talking about the students picking leaves and boiling them up and eating them because that's all they had. So the Great Leap Forward is quite a disaster. Mao loses a little bit of support within the party after that, since it wasn't good for the country. But as I said, Mao may not have been good at economics, but he was good at politics. As he had lost some support, he needed a way to get power back. So what he did was he came upon the idea of young people, students, who he believed would follow him very, I guess we could say blindly. And they did. And these become the infamous Red Guards, who, at the height of the Cultural Revolution, roam the city side, denouncing anyone they sort of choose to denounce. Parents, teachers, rulers, all kinds of people. So it was a period in which just about anyone could be denounced as being a rightist or a long roader. They had all kinds of terms for it. And you were usually put on some kind of examination, public examination. You were put in what I would tend to think of as a kangaroo court. The outcome of which might be you have to be marched around with a sign confessing your guilt all the way to death. So there was a range of things. So the Cultural Revolution is really for us almost an inconceivably complex and chaotic time. In many ways it brings back a chaos to China that the Chinese don't appreciate very much. One of my teachers of Mandarin lived through the Cultural Revolution. She doesn't like to talk about it a ton, but I can get her to talk about it a bit at some points in time. And one story she has told me about, we would go out in the fall and we would dig the tunnels because the Americans were coming to bomb us. And none of us knew anything about digging tunnels. None of us had shovels. We had little garden tools and that. But we would go around Shanghai digging these tunnels. And then 6 months later, we'd fill them all in again and dig them somewhere else so that the Americans would know what these tunnels were. I said, did you ever get in the tunnels? And she laughed and said, God, no. They were death traps. I mean, we didn't know what we were doing. We were just digging little tunnels. Now, she considers herself extraordinarily lucky to have been doing that for 5 years of her life as opposed to getting involved in the Cultural Revolution in any other way. After Mao's death, we get Deng Xiaoping, who had been part of the Communist Party and had been in and out of favor with Mao. And Deng Xiaoping had always favored economic reform. And in 1978, he begins opening up China and reforming its economy. And he's noted for this, and I think, again, I would remind us that we probably should remember or conceive of Deng Xiaoping as changing the whole world with the economic reforms that he instituted in China. I've also mentioned Tiananmen Square, and this is still a controversial issue inside of China. But I mention it because, in a way, for me personally, it reflects the tragic flaw in Deng. I think of Deng, as many academics do, as really a visionary, a great leader for China. He really had the best. He finally solved the century and a half of chaos for China, but he didn't have the courage to follow through on the political side. He didn't have enough support inside the party. They were scared about what was happening. In Tiananmen Square, you may recall, there were thousands of students demanding more democracy, more freedom, more opening up. They had been influenced by glasnost in the Soviet Empire, and they were really demanding political reform in China. And there is a period, when you study it now, where inside the party there was a fierce debate about whether they should let them have reform or not let them have reform. And this is the tragic flaw of Deng. He backed down, and he didn't have the courage to follow through, so he sent in the tanks, and 1,500, 2,000 people died. And he restored order, but at a great cost to the political structure of China. So there's different ways to look at it. And Deng is one of my favorite Chinese leaders to read because he has a wonderful, direct way of writing. And this is one of his most famous sayings. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. This is all you need to know about economic reform for Deng in China. What works, works. We don't care about the ideology. And then the wonderful one at the bottom. Poverty is not equatable with socialism. To get rich is glorious. You know, when you study China and you know it as a communist country, the largest, stable, long-lasting communist country on the planet, and you read one of its most important leaders saying to get rich is glorious, you really have to put the book down and stop and think about that for a minute, because it really does make you think. The last thing I want to talk about in contextualizing China is the family, the collective, and culture. These are the pillars of the Chinese society. And we need to bear these in mind when we think about China. China has strong filial loyalties. These are family loyalties. Family is enormously important to the Chinese in a way that in the West we almost can't understand. In China, when you start to learn Chinese, there's a thing. The Chinese have a name for every person in the family, and what I mean is a name for the title. So they have a separate name for your older brother's younger daughter than they do for your younger brother's older daughter. So there's literally hundreds of individual names. And this is very important because it denotes the respect and the place they have in the family. And it baffles Westerners. Why can't you just say brother, sister, niece? Doesn't work that way. Fortunately, I guess, for me, usually they don't expect us to know those. So we get away with something. They're highly collective. The Chinese, for thousands of years, have viewed the collective above the individual. And so this helps us understand why communism in some ways is a fit, or socialism is a fit for China in certain ways. In the West, we value individuality, and in China, they value collectivity. The Chinese are also devoted to their culture. They have a strong sense of culturalism. They believe their culture to be a great culture, which I also believe it is. And this is very, very important to them. The last thing I would say is you can never truly know China and the Chinese until you know food. The Chinese value food in a way that few of us in the West can even comprehend. Food in China is fantastic. It's worth going there just to eat. But food is very important for the Chinese. Sitting down and eating with their family, with their friends, with other people is extraordinarily important to them. When I first went to China, I would go and eat in Chinese restaurants, and by that I mean not tourist restaurants, local restaurants, by myself. And I would go by myself because I wanted to force myself to practice my Mandarin. And more than once I went into a restaurant and they were really alarmed by the fact that I was eating alone. I even had a manager once in Pudong insist that I join a large family at a big round table because the idea of eating alone was so horrible to him and to the family. And they're all come and join us and eat with us. And they don't, in some ways, many Chinese don't understand the West and our relationship to food. I have a friend in China who said, I don't get the drive to McDonald's in a big hurry in your car and buy the worst piece of garbage food on the planet and eat it really quickly and give yourself indigestion. It just seems such a waste. The Chinese consider eating one of the great pleasures of life, and they don't understand why we wouldn't indulge in that. So now I want to talk about learning Mandarin, and I'm going to speed up just a little bit here. And I'm going to talk about the warm porridge people in just a minute. I couldn't resist pouring myself. It's really hard. Many of us probably know that Chinese characters are pictographic in their origins. And I wanted to just give you some examples of these so you can understand how they work. At the top we've got mu, and my pronunciation is going to be really bad today for my Chinese friends because I'm a little nervous speaking it in public, so forgive me. Mu, which is tree, and you can see the resemblance to a tree. Then we have lin, which is a grove, which is just two trees side by side. Then we'll take three trees and put them together, and we get sen, which is a forest. And this is the way pictographs basically work thousands of years ago in China. We have ren, person, and you can spot the two little legs if nothing else. One of my favorites, xiao, which when I learned this one, I fell in love with Mandarin characters. That's on the left, that's a person, that's a radical for person, and on the right, it's a tree. So to rest is to sit under a tree, and that's where that pictogram comes from. Then a couple of other ones at the bottom, niar as bird, and then yu for rain. And those, I think, you can see where the pictographic things come from. But let's talk a little bit about contemporary Mandarin characters. Most Mandarin characters today are not strictly pictographic. They're phonetic, semantic combination characters. So they have both a semantic element and a phonetic element. Just to give you a sense, there's about 2,000 to 3,000 characters one needs to know to function and read newspapers and generally get by in China. If you want to really go for it, there's somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Chinese characters. No, Chinese people don't know 80,000 characters, for those of you not versed in Mandarin. And in fact, by the scale of that number from 60 to 80,000, there's a large margin of error. Nobody really knows how many characters there are. And many of these are antiquated characters or very esoteric characters. And by the way, for those of you not reading Mandarin, that's Janada on the left. And that was written in Shanghai by a fellow I met. In China, they love on hot days to go out on the pavement and practice calligraphy, and it dries up in about 30 seconds, and then they just write some more, and they write some more. And we were talking, and he was quite excited to talk to me in Mandarin, so he was drawing out the Canada, the word for Canada, Janada. And it's quite lovely to watch them work. Now I want to talk a little bit about spoken Mandarin. Chinese love to speak, and China has, Chinese spoken Mandarin has tones. Some of you may know this. And tones in Chinese, there's only 4 in Mandarin. There's, I think, 8 in Cantonese, so I didn't study Cantonese. But tones have both, they have primarily semantic meaning. That is, they change the meaning of a word. Tones are used by us in English, but only for non-semantic meaning, so surprise, anger, things like that. So I'm going to teach you what every beginning Chinese Mandarin speaker learns, or Mandarin student learns, and that's ma. Ma is a fairly simple word. We have that sound in most languages around the world. In China, there's 4 tones. So I'll go through those tones quickly. The first one is called the first tone, and you'll see the little line over the A. It's a strong high tone, so it would be something like ma. Second tone, down below that with the rising, is exactly as it looks like. It's a rising tone, so it would be something like ma. I know I did that. Third tone is the big V, and it's kind of shaped like a V. It's a drop and a rise, so it's the most easy to hear, and it would be something like ma. And the fourth tone is the sharp downward tone, which would be something approximating ma. Now, the thing to note is that these tones change the meaning. Ma means mother, ma means horse. So if you get your tones wrong, which as a beginning Mandarin speaker you do a lot, you call your mother a horse. And it gets a lot worse than that, let me tell you. There's a lot of humor in learning Mandarin. It's just unavoidable. So now I want to talk about the limited phonetic inventory of Mandarin. Mandarin only has about 400 distinct sound syllables, only about 400 different sounds. Now, it has, as I said, 4 tones, so if we multiply it out, it has the potential for about 1,600 unique sounds with the 4 tones. It only uses about 1,100 of these. So there's about 1,100 unique syllabic sounds that can be made and used in Mandarin. By comparison, English has the potential for 80,000 unique syllable sounds, because we're a lot more lax about how we put sounds together. We only use about 16,000, it's estimated in English. But still, we have 16,000 different sounds we use to make words. The Chinese have about 1,100. To overcome this limit, the Chinese have many, many, many homophones. A homophone is simply a word, a different word that has the same sound. We do have them in English, all and all, soul and soul. In English, we have about 450, 441, if you want to be exact, although there's, I'm sure the linguists fight about it. So we have about 450 words that sound the same as another word, but mean something completely different. By comparison, the Sihai Dictionary, which is one of the massive dictionaries in Chinese, lists 149 different homophonic characters for the single syllable yi. So that one sound, yi, has 149 different meanings that sound identical, compared with 440 in our entire language. Ask how many homophones there are in Chinese, which I did to a couple of linguists, and they just laughed. The Chinese expression, which I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but it can't be counted. It can't be counted. It's even at the limited level of Mandarin I have, most of the words I know have 4 or 5 distinct homophonic meanings, and that creates a great deal of fun. It's really a lot of fun. This is a classic example, and I just want to put it up here to sort of give you a sense of how the Chinese work with language and why they love language the way they do. The 3 characters right at the top of this one, Wenzhou Ren. Wenzhou is a city, so Wenzhou, just the name of the city. Ren, as I told you, was person. So Wenzhou Ren just means a person from Wenzhou. So if you're from Canada, you'd be a Janata Ren. So Wenzhou Ren. So there's a porridge shop in Wenzhou. But you want to have a little bit of fun. So you replace the second character, which is pronounced Zhou, with a completely different character that's also pronounced Zhou, that happens to mean porridge. And you create this result here, Wenzhou Ren, which sounds identical. It's a complete homophone for the first one. But it literally means warm porridge people. Because Wen becomes, it reverts to its real meaning, or its independent meaning, which is warm. So when a Chinese person looks at that sign, they would read it as warm porridge people, which is a pretty interesting name for a porridge shop in Wenzhou. But I like this example because it gives us a sense of how the Chinese play with their language and their characters all the time. It's all through the Chinese experience. They know what it says, so they're laughing. Part 3 I'm going to call naughty language, because part of what that says is if you're naughty, something's going to happen to you. Resistance on the Chinese internet. The internet is God's present to China. It provided the best tool for the Chinese people in their project to cast off slavery and strive for freedom. So quickly, just to let you know, China is the largest internet in the world by a huge amount. There's over 500,000 Chinese internet users. There's 300 billion Chinese bloggers. They're just behind the Americans in terms of money spent on the internet, but they're rapidly catching up. So now I want to talk about the central idea of my talk, which is Sao Ni Ma. Sao Ni Ma. I have to be so careful, and I'm going to get this wrong. And you'll know in a minute why I have to be careful. Because this is kind of like that ma where I called my mom a horse, only it's worse. So, said properly, Sao Ni Ma means grass mud horse. And that's what the Chinese will use online, because the censors don't notice it. Today they actually do. It's been around for 5 years. The censors know about it. But when it began, it got through the censors. Now, if you say, it's slightly differently when you say, Sao Ni Ma, instead of saying grass mud horse, you're actually saying, excuse me, that's your mother, which would be roughly equivalent to the English mother. So you can understand why our friends are laughing. You can also understand why one has to be careful learning Mandarin. So what this means in the vernacular for the Chinese, because mother in this case refers to the motherland, which really means the party. So it's really a colloquial way of saying F the party. So it's a fairly serious and significant challenge to the Communist Party. It's probably the most widely used homophone, or was, on the internet. It's a hero. The grassland horse is a hero of these online citizens or netizens because it battles the river crabs, which I'll talk about in a minute. I just want to point out that we might tend to think that censorship is very tight in China. Actually, censorship is very loose in China. That is to say, they censor at a very high level. They don't want large-scale movements. But on the ground with individuals, they don't pay much attention to it. I think there's 2 reasons. 1, they don't care that much, and 2, there's 1.364 billion people, so they can't. So you can go to Shanghai or Beijing, and you can buy Sao Ni Ma hoodies, Sao Ni Ma plushies, Sao Ni Ma t-shirts, Sao Ni Ma coffee cups, Sao Ni Ma hats. You go online and order this stuff. You can see people wearing it around China. The government knows exactly what it means. It's now a verboten word, but you have no problem buying it on the streets of China. So they have a complex relationship. Now I quickly go through some of the other homophones. This is the he or river crab. It's a homophone for he, which means harmony. And harmony is used by the Communist Party as a rationale for censorship. To create a harmonious party, they need to censor. So when online netizens use the river crab, they're talking about censorship. So the grass mud horse battles the river crab. The grass mud horse is the hero, the river crab is the villain. So it's a euphemism for censorship. It wears 3 watches. I won't go into the details of why. It has to do with another homophonic reference to a policy in China. And it battles the grass mud horse. So these are the most famous of these 2 characters. Then we have the ho shi, the monkey snake. One of my favorites. The homophone is ho shi. It's a true homophone. And it simply translates to mouthpiece. It's a human monkey face at each end and a snake in the middle. It refers to the spokespeople of the Communist Party. And according to human rights activist Wen Yunqiao, the monkey snake is a mammal with a developed brain and a human monkey face. He has the head of a monkey and the body of a snake. His rear end, interestingly, also resembles a face. He is skilled at imitating human language, but he is invariably lying, usually from both ends at once. So now I'll move beyond grass mud. There's a lot of grass mud horse. There's literally dozens and dozens of grass mud horse characters. I'm not going to go through them all because of time and the fact that they get really rude. But they're all used as ways for the Chinese people to avoid censorship. So they use the homophonic meaning. It literally means one thing, but they know it means something else to get away with what they want to say. So this is another common homophone that you see more on the walls in China. The English word for China is China. Those 2 characters are China. I'm saying it badly again, but literally they translate to what shall we tear down now? Or not literally, but a good translation is what do we tear down now? So it's infamous that in China they'll go around saying, China, China. What do we tear down now? What do we pull apart? What do we get rid of? And this is resistance. There's resistance to this in Beijing and other cities because they want to preserve some of old China. So this is a bit of a battle. The next one I want to talk about is Pui Guo, which is expensive country. It's a sarcastic reference to the high cost of living in China. It also has an allusion to the honorific Gui, which is how one would refer to it's an honorific one would use to a respected person. So in a way, they're ironically referring to their leaders and saying it's your country, which by implication means it's not my country or our country. It's run for the rich people. This is a poster from the Cultural Revolution from the Mao era, and they always were doing this with shovels or stuff because they were going to build a better China, but there they've got fists of yuan or renminbi in their hands. And it would originally have, this one said, what do we want? When do we want it? We want it now. What do we want? We want the people's paradise. Over there it says, what do we want? When do we want it? We want it now. What do we want? Lots of money or more money. So it's sarcastic. This is a card I bought in Shanghai. I really like this card. They love the panda and they love the space program because it's really happening in China. So you look at the bottom there. Integrate commodity prices with European standards. Integrate housing prices with moon standards. Integrate wages with African standards. This is a common kind of complaint you'll hear. To buy a house is ridiculous. To buy commodities is less ridiculous but expensive, and we get paid nothing. So this is the expensive country model. This is another one of my favorites. This is Ying Di, movie star. This is former Premier Wen Jiabo. He was noted for showing up at disaster areas and crying and being just, oh, I'm so sorry it happened. He's also noted for his family's amassing over $3 billion in state-owned shares in state-owned companies, as the New York Times reported, and the Chinese government didn't like them doing that. So he was often awarded somebody's photoshopped the Academy Award in his hands there. And so when they say movie star, they're referring to Wen Jiabo. Another one I want to talk about is Dang Zhongyang, block the center. Deng Zhongyang means party central committee because Deng, with this character, means party. Zongyang meaning center or middle. So it's a way of referring to the party indirectly. So if we use Deng Zhongyang with the characters at the top, it means block the center. So you can see they're kind of, it's often used, it can also mean block the crotch, which is, you see it there. That translates, that's Han Han, he's a dissident, and he had a short-lived magazine in Shanghai. And essentially what this suggests is the party central has the guns. You can understand why it was short-lived. They didn't like it so much. This is a very famous photo in China. That's Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei is probably the best-known Chinese artist in the West. And Ai Weiwei is leaping there, and he's got a plushie of the grass mud horse covering his middle. And it literally says, Sami Ma Dang Zhong Yang, which means grass mud horse block the center. What he's really saying in what would be understood by online citizens is FU Party Central Committee. The thing with Ai Weiwei is he has a large international following, and this went viral very quickly, both within and without China. Unfortunately, he was arrested not long after this, and has been in and out of arrest and house arrest since then. This wasn't the only thing he's done. This was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, but Ai Weiwei has paid a price for this. He also has, if you go on YouTube, he has an awesome Sami Ma remake of the Korean gangsta pop hit. It's wonderful. Last thing I want to do is I want to talk about what this all means, what I call the left turn signal, and this is China at the crossroads. The left turn signal is a reference to a joke that's told inside and outside China. Uncle Sam and Chairman Mao are driving along in a car, and there's a taxi, I think. There's a taxi driver up front, and they're whipping down the road, and they're getting along just great. And they come to a fork in the road. And the driver turns first to Uncle Sam and says, which way do you want to go? Do you want to go left, or do you want to go right? Uncle Sam says, well, I'm Uncle Sam. Of course, I want to go right. And then he looks at Mao and says, well, what about you, Mao? Mao says, this is a good question. I agree, we should go right. But can you put on the left turn signal while we do that for me? This is a reference, an oblique, not so oblique, reference to capitalism with socialistic characteristics, which is a term they like to use and has been popular the last 30 years. Which is in a sense, it reflects how the Chinese Communist Party has had to sort of wiggle around a bit to reconcile the fact that it's a straight-ahead communist socialist party, and it's currently one of the most capitalistic countries on earth. So they've really had to do a little bit of wiggling to figure this out, and that's the term they like to use, capitalism with socialist characteristics. China is a journalist's dream and a statistician's nightmare. China is a place with more human drama and fewer verifiable facts per square mile than anywhere on Earth. John King Fairbank, a famous psychologist from Harvard. It really captures China in a nutshell, I think. So there's two dominant narratives about the internet in China. And these narratives are dominant for the internet and social media in a lot of repressed regimes around the world. And they go something like this. The first narrative is that the internet is going to set us free. The society is empowered by the net. It forces governments into transparency. It creates space for civil society and democracy to grow. It's a really great thing. Even in the West, where we're democratic, supposedly, the internet will bring more democracy and better democracy. So this is the cheerleaders, if you will. But it's a strong narrative supported by many people. The second version, also supported by many people, is the opposite. That essentially the internet enables surveillance and control. The internet is in this model, a phenomenal tool for governments to surveil and control and be aware of what their people are doing. It magnifies propaganda and allows the government to control the conversation more tightly. It encourages self-censorship, and this is the key point in this model, because when you think your email may be read, your posting to Twitter or in a Weibo may be read, when you think all these things will be read, you will learn to censor yourself. You will learn to not write things you think will get you in trouble. And it doesn't take much to understand that self-censorship is really the goal of any authoritarian regime, because then they don't have to get involved in it. People are censoring themselves. And it allows the government to monopolize secrecy. When more of our conversations in civil society moves online, according to this theory, it becomes easier for the government to be the only one who can really operate in secrecy. So according to this theory as it's written, this is what will happen when authoritarian governments use the internet to surveil and attempt to control their people, to invade the privacy. As we in the West now understand in the last year, is also something our governments are doing. So this conversation is relevant not only in China. So there's these two dominant narratives, and they are a zero-sum game, more or less. So what's the reality? The reality, interestingly enough, is that China is going in both directions, and this really can be seen quite clearly. We see, for example, declines in the use of Sena Weibao since the government brought in laws essentially criminalizing the use of media for spreading dissent. And they did it in a very clever way. What the law says is if you post something online and more than 5,000 people view it, or it's forwarded more than 500 times, you become accountable under this law for the results of that. And the government will decide later what the results of that are. If it's judged that your posting was disharmonious and caused disharmony, you can get up to 10 years in prison. So when you post it, you don't know how many people are going to look at it. If it's more than 5,000, this law applies to you. If the government 4 years later decides it was disharmonious, they will come and pick you up and put you in prison for as long as they choose to. So in the past 8 months since this law came into effect, tens of millions of people have left Sena Weibo, and we have seen a complete drop-off of the use of these online homophonic resistance things. So the Chinese government has been very effective in, at least at this point, curtailing the ability of this social media to be used in this way. At the same time, social media has been used extensively in China to shame officials. One of the things that the new regime has really talked about is their desire to cut out corruption in China. So many Chinese have taken to photographing or videotaping local officials doing things that they shouldn't be doing. They love to post them online. They get a lot of hits, they get a lot of attention, the media picks them up, and then the central party has to do something about it. So there's tons of examples where the social media and the ability to share information has caused the government to change, move, to have to deal with certain things. So what we come to the conclusion is that both things are happening. Both these scenarios seem to be working in parallel, and we don't really know where that's going. So I just want to wrap up by giving you some of my observations, talking a little bit about some of the lessons I think we can learn, and then some of the questions I think that still are out there for China. So these are my observations. The majority of the Chinese people do not align themselves tightly with the Communist Party anymore. There was a time, I think, when the majority of Chinese were very optimistic about the party, but most researchers say after the Cultural Revolution that tended to end. People saw the excesses of the party, and they've never really gone back to loving it in that way. But it's important to note that neither do the vast majority of Chinese despise the Communist Party. The Chinese recognize what their current government has given them. It's given them stability, it's banished chaos, and it has given them unbelievable growth. It has returned pride to their country. They're stronger than they've been for the past 150, 200 years. And this is very important to the Chinese psyche. So their relationship with the government is more nuanced than we might think in the West. Most Chinese are far more interested in the West than Westerners are interested in China. It's a simple observation, not absolute. But my experience in China and with Chinese individuals outside China is that they're very interested in the West. They believe there's lots to learn from the West. They're interested in how things work here. They're very keen to know more about us. That's not reciprocated by and large. The West is not that interested in China. We tend to be relatively ignorant of China, and we tend to stick to very simplistic views of China. And I think this is a big issue for us in the West. I think it's something we need more academic and societal interest in study of China. Remember that every Chinese student today learns English. It's part of the mandatory education. And in North America, 0.0000, there's a bunch of O's, 0.0006 North Americans will ever attempt to learn Mandarin. So very, very few of us ever even attempt to learn Mandarin. Almost every Chinese student learns English. Many Chinese are fascinated by the West, but they don't want to become Western. We should not mistake their interest in the West with a desire to be us. They're very proud of their country. They're very proud of their culture. They like who they are. They're not interested in becoming the West. And I think that's something, especially south of the border, that some politicians don't quite fathom. And many Chinese do not understand Western attitudes towards China. They're baffled, especially by American attitudes. A common thing when I would meet Chinese students and people in Chinese universities, and the trust would build to the level that I could have frank conversations with them, and we would talk about the West and political attitudes. And I heard this time and time again was, I do not understand why the West vilifies China. Why are the Americans always talking about China, its military, its evil thing? Why are they talking about China's, attempt to take over things? China has no troops outside of China. China hasn't bombed another country. America has troops in 150 countries. They're currently bombing in a dozen countries around the world. Yet the Americans say we're so bad. We're to be feared. The Americans should be feared. So they don't understand this, what appears to be a double standard. We seem to look at the West and say, well, we're doing that for the right reasons. And China might do something we don't like, and if they might do it, it might be for the wrong reasons. So this is something that I come against time and time again. Just to wrap up, a few other things I want to mention. I want to mention that I've said numerous times that Chinese are proud of their country. And it bears noting that in China, there's an ability to be proud of your country that we almost don't have anymore in the West. When we're proud of our country, it's always with a bit of irony. There's always irony dangerously close to our pride in our country because we're aware of nationalism, imperialism, jingoism, all these things. The Chinese don't have this. They have a pride in their country that's extraordinarily straightforward. And they don't really understand the way in the West we sometimes aren't sure about being proud of our country. China's rejection of democracy irks our friends to the South precisely because the Americans think democracy is their special gift to the world. So how could anyone not want it? Americans don't get why the Chinese might not want democracy. So lessons to be learned. China cannot be understood through a Western perspective. We simply can't do it. We can study statistics, and we try to study it through Western economics. In the West, that's one of the common things we're seeing now, is we want to understand China through Western economics, but I don't think that works particularly well. I don't think we can really understand China through a Western perspective. When we think of the People's Republic, we need to think of those 2,600 years of centralized, autocratic, stable, successful rule. And really, the current government in China is an extension of that. It's not some radically different thing that was foisted on the Chinese. In many ways, it's very familiar to the Chinese. This is also very important to remember or to know. Many of us don't know this. When China takes over from the U.S. as the world's largest economy, it will return to the historical norms of the past 2,000 years. China was the largest economy on Earth for most of 1,500 years. Up until the early part of the 19th century, China was the largest economy on Earth. In the mid-17th century, the estimate today is that China was 35% of the world's economy. So when China returns to being the largest economy on the planet, it will just be a return to the way it was for hundreds and thousands of years. In fact, it looks like America will be the world's largest economy for a very short amount of time if we look at it in this large historical perspective. The last thing I want to say is in the West, we really need to develop better narratives and better understanding of China. We sort of have two dominant narratives that are discussed academically about China and politically. One is this, it's sort of what I consider the bipolar narratives. We kind of flip between them. Either they're a rising peril, my gosh, look at all those soldiers. Don't they have a lot of soldiers and guns and missiles, and my goodness, they're a threat to us. Or we flip over and say they're our economic partners. They won't hurt us because they've invested in our country so much. You know, they're not really going to be a competitor to America because they own so much of America, blah, blah, blah. I think neither of these are become anywhere close to being true. But they seem to be the best narratives we can come up with for understanding China, and they're failing us. In the West, as countries, as governments, as entities, this really facile understanding of China is hurting us. We don't know, I think, how much it's hurting us. So, just some questions to leave you with, and I'll wrap up quickly. I'm a little bit over, but I'll probably get away with it. First question, can democracy work in China? Not do they want it, can it work? I think this is an open question. This by no means is a settled question. China is enormously complex. What alternatives are there, if not Western democracy, which I don't think is coming anytime soon? How should the West react to China's growing Asian ascendancy? So China is returning to its natural place as the largest, strongest power in Asia, and this makes the West uncomfortable. The Chinese name for China, or the most common Chinese name for China, is Zhongguo, which literally means middle country. And we probably heard it referred to as the middle kingdom. It's the middle of everything. It's the center. That's what they were in Asia for 2,700 years. So China, as they become strong once again, they see it as a natural thing for them to assume that position in Asia. And they have a little bit of trouble with Americans telling them that they shouldn't assume that position, that America should maintain that position as the center of Asian politics and power, since America is actually 5,000 kilometers across the ocean from Asia. How should the West react to China's growing global ascendancy? China is obviously the rising global power right now. No one doubts that. How do we react to that? How do we respond to that? China has reshaped our world. As I said before, and I can't emphasize this enough, the economic changes in China have influenced and changed our world dramatically. So how do we respond to this? It seems to me right now our response is relatively limited to how can we make money off it. That really seems to be about the extent of Western consideration of the Chinese economic situation and their reemergence as a power. How can we make some money off it? And then, of course, the last one, how can the West better understand China? What do we have to do to understand China? This is really a challenge, I think, to the universities more than anything. What do we need to be doing to come to a country like Canada, and we're all about Asia, we're all about that Asian perspective, and we're a big country, and we have, at this point in time, 5 universities you can major in Mandarin. 5 small little programs, about 80, I think it's 80 to 100 students a year can major in Mandarin in Canada, even if they want to. It's pathetic. Most of the universities in Canada have no Asian studies program of any type. So we're not changing our failure to understand China. If anything, it's getting worse over time. So the last thing I would leave you with is the resurgent pride of China. I think China is an enormously proud country with good reason, and I think that's something that we have to understand and come to terms with. China is not interested in continuing 150 years of feeling somehow beholding to the West, and that's something we need to come to terms with. We see this pride in things like the Olympics, the space program, the economic miracle in all these ways. So China is really growing. This is a picture I took in Shanghai just to finish up now. And to me, it just captures China in a nutshell. There's 2 Chinese policemen, one's on a little platform, one's on a Segway. It's a really big subway station. It takes about 20 minutes to walk across it. And in the background is a giant sign saying, sail, 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 sail. And it's just the epitome of China when you're in it today. in that it has these great conflicts happen. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about in terms of China, and hopefully it was entertaining and interesting. Thank you.